I should have turned back the moment I saw the cave. The entrance was nothing like the photographs. In the pictures, it was a simple opening in the Appalachian wilderness, an unremarkable crack in the earth, waiting to be explored. But standing before it now, something felt wrong. The mouth of the cave was too dark, swallowing the light like a living thing. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and carried a damp, metallic scent. It reminded me of old blood. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to shake the feeling off. Behind me, my team finished unloading the last of our equipment from the truck. Ethan, my cameraman, adjusted his gear, muttering about the temperature drop. Sarah, our geologist, studied the jagged rock formations, tracing the strange, swirling patterns etched into them. Neither of them seemed as unsettled as I was. "James," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Look at this." I stepped closer, following her gaze to a set of markings carved into the rock beside the entrance. The symbols were old, older than any known indigenous tribe in the region. They curved and twisted in ways that didn't make sense, almost as if they had been etched by an unsteady hand. Or something else. "Doesn't match anything I've seen before," she murmured, brushing her fingers over the surface. "It's almost like a warning." Ethan scoffed. "Or maybe just some ancient graffiti." I forced a chuckle. "Or that." But the unease in my gut only grew. The town we had stopped in before reaching the caves was small, barely a dot on the map. The locals had been polite enough, but the moment I mentioned our destination, their faces darkened. An old man at the gas station had grabbed my arm, his fingers trembling. "Don't go in there," he had whispered. "People go missing." "Ain't natural. What's in there?" I had laughed it off at the time. I had heard plenty of legends before, tales meant to keep outsiders away. I had no reason to believe this one was any different. And yet, as I stood before the gaping black mouth of the cave, something deep inside me hesitated. Sarah adjusted her pack. "We should get moving. Daylight won't last forever." I nodded and forced one foot in front of the other. The ground beneath me sloped downward, uneven and damp. The deeper we walked, the quieter everything became. The wind outside faded, the chirping of birds vanished. Even the sound of our footsteps seemed swallowed by the darkness. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Almost too faint to notice. I stopped. The others didn't seem to hear it. "James?" Ethan asked. "You good?" I stared into the tunnel ahead, the darkness stretching infinitely before us. I could have sworn I heard something calling my name, but that was impossible. Shaking off the feeling, I forced a smile. "Yeah, let's keep going." As we moved deeper, the shadows grew heavier, pressing against us like unseen hands. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stories meant nothing. I told myself we would be fine. I had no idea how wrong I was. The air inside the cave was thick, almost heavy, as if the darkness itself had weight. Our headlamps sliced through the pitch black, revealing jagged walls and uneven ground. The entrance had long disappeared behind us, swallowed by the endless tunnels stretching ahead. I led the way, my boots crunching against loose rocks. Behind me, Daniel and Claire followed closely, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. Even our breaths felt muffled, like the cave was swallowing sound itself. "Feels off, doesn't it?" Claire whispered. Her voice barely carried, as if the cave was draining it. Daniel chuckled nervously. "It's just the air pressure. Deep caves mess with your hearing." Maybe he was right. But still, something gnawed at the edges of my mind. Something about this place was different. After an hour of careful descent, we reached a wide chamber. My light revealed strange markings on the walls, etched deep, worn by time. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers over the carvings. They weren't random scratches. They formed symbols, repeating patterns that almost looked like writing. "James, look at this," Claire called from the other side of the chamber. She pointed at a section of the wall where the carvings changed. Instead of symbols, there were figures. Human-like but distorted. Their limbs were too long, their faces stretched into unnatural shapes. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Who the hell made these?" I shook my head. "They look ancient. Way older than anything recorded in this region." Claire took a step back, her face pale. "I don't like this." Before I could respond, a soft sound drifted through the tunnel behind us. A whisper. Faint. indistinct. We all froze. Daniel turned sharply, shining his light into the passage. Did you hear that? I swallowed. Probably just air currents. The whisper came again. Closer. I felt a cold sweat break across my skin. It was a voice, but not one I recognized. And it wasn't coming from any of us. Claire clutched her flashlight tighter. James, we should go back. I hesitated. Every rational part of me agreed. But another part, the part that had brought me here, the part that needed to uncover the truth, kept me rooted in place. We'll be fine, I said, though my voice felt weaker than I wanted it to. Let's keep moving. Daniel sighed but nodded. Claire hesitated, then followed. As we pressed forward, the whispers faded, but I could feel something watching us. Something just beyond the reach of our lights, hidden in the endless dark. And for the first time since stepping into this cave, I wondered if we had made a mistake coming here. The tunnel ahead of us stretched into blackness, the kind that swallowed the beam of a flashlight like it was nothing. The air had changed, thicker, colder. My breath felt heavy in my chest, and a strange sense of pressure weighed down on me, as if the walls were slowly tightening with every step. We had been hiking through the cavern for hours. The deeper we went, the less it felt like a place meant for people. There was no life here, no insects, no distant drip of water. Just silence, stretching endlessly in all directions. And then we saw him. A man stood at the far edge of our light, his silhouette barely distinguishable from his shadows. His clothes hung off his thin frame like they had once belonged to someone larger. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp bones. But his eyes, they gleamed in the darkness, reflecting our lights in a way that made my stomach twist. I raised a hand, signaling the team to stop. My pulse pounded in my ears. We hadn't expected to find anyone down here. No one should be here. Who's there? I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The man took a step closer, and I felt the temperature drop. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were considering something. When he finally spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper, yet it carried through the cave as though the walls themselves were listening. You shouldn't be here. I swallowed. We're explorers, I said. We're mapping the cave system. Are you lost? The man, Fago, as I would later learn, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Lost. His head tilted slightly, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my skin crawl. No, not lost. I belong here. You, however, he trailed off, his gaze flickering toward the tunnel behind us. I exchanged glances with my team. Caleb, our lead geologist, shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening around his flashlight. Ava, our medic, stood rigid, her breath shallow. We all felt it. Something was wrong with this place, and this man was part of it. Do you live down here? I asked, though I already knew the answer was something I wouldn't like. Fago exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. No one lives here, he murmured. Only those who listen, and those who are heard. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? He took another step forward, and instinctively, I stepped back. The walls are listening, he said. Once they hear you, you don't leave. I glanced at Caleb and Ava again, trying to gauge their reactions. They looked just as unsettled as I felt. I wanted to press Fago for answers, but there was something about him, something in the way he spoke, the way he moved, that made me feel as if I shouldn't. We need to keep moving, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. Do you need help getting out? Fago let out another hollow laugh. Out? He shook his head. No, I warned the others before you. They didn't listen. They don't leave either. A thick silence followed his words, pressing in from all sides. My grip on my flashlight tightened. Others? Ava asked cautiously. What others? Fago didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step back, melting into the shadows as if the cave itself had swallowed him. In the beam of my flashlight, I could just barely make out his mouth moving. A whisper drifted through the darkness, barely audible. You've gone too far. The deeper you go, the less of yourself you'll bring back. Then he was gone. For a long moment, none of us moved. The silence around us felt heavier than before, as if something unseen had woken up. Caleb's breathing was sharp and unsteady. Ava's hands trembled at her sides. James, Caleb finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to leave. I should have agreed. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back. But something about Thago's words, about the way he had spoken, made me hesitate. He knew something. Something I needed to understand. No, I said, my voice firm despite the icy fear creeping into my bones. We keep going. Ava's expression darkened. James. We need to know what he meant. I looked past them, deeper into the tunnel where Thago had disappeared. The darkness seemed to shift, breathing in a way I couldn't explain. The walls are listening. I turned back to my team, my decision made. Let's move. And so we did. Further into the abyss, where the whispers grew louder. I woke up to silence. A silence so deep it felt unnatural. No wind. No distant dripping of water. Just a thick, suffocating stillness. For a moment, I lay there, staring up at the jagged ceiling of the cave. My breath was loud in my ears, too loud. I turned my head slightly and saw the dim glow of our lanterns flickering against the rocky walls. Something fell off. I pushed myself up, my body aching from sleeping on the hard ground. My flashlight sat beside me. I grabbed it and swept the beam around our small camp. Everyone's sleeping bags were there, except for one. Ethan, I called out, my voice hoarse. No response. I turned toward the others. Noah was curled up in his bag, his breathing slow and steady. Sam was further back, near the cave wall, buried under his blanket. Neither of them stirred. I swallowed the uneasy feeling building in my chest and stood up. The cold wrapped around me, biting at my skin. I walked to where Ethan had been sleeping, my boots crunching against the loose gravel. His bag was still there, unzipped, the fabric bunched up as if he had left in a hurry. His helmet and flashlight lay beside it. I turned to the others and shook Noah by the shoulder. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What? He mumbled, still half asleep. Ethan's gone, I said. That woke him up. He sat up quickly, blinking at me in the dim light. What do you mean gone? I gestured at the empty sleeping bag. He's not here. Noah ran a hand through his messy hair, looking around as if expecting Ethan to suddenly appear. He nudged Sam awake while I walked a few steps away, shining my flashlight into the surrounding darkness. Ethan, I called again. My voice echoed, bouncing off the cave walls and disappearing into the endless black. Nothing. Sam sat up, rubbing his face. What's going on? Ethan's missing, Noah said, his voice tight. Sam frowned. Maybe you want to take a piss. Without his flashlight? Without his helmet? I gestured toward the untouched gear. That doesn't make sense. We all stood there for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I turned toward the tunnels leading deeper into the cave. There were too many of them, winding like veins into the earth. If Ethan had wandered off, finding him wouldn't be easy. We need to look for him, I said. Noah nodded, already reaching for his helmet. Sam, though, hesitated. His face was pale in the lantern light. This doesn't feel right, he muttered. Ethan wouldn't just leave like that. I didn't have a response, because I felt it too. The wrongness of it all. We spread out, keeping each other within sight, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. I kept calling Ethan's name, but only my own voice echoed back. We searched for what felt like hours, deeper into the tunnels, where the air was thinner, where the walls seemed to close in, where the silence became something else, something alive. And then we found it. Not Ethan, but his radio. It lay on the cold ground, its screen flickering weakly. And next to it, something that made my skin crawl. Strange symbols, scratched into the stone. Symbols we had never seen before. And beneath them, one word. Listen. I turned to Noah and Sam, my heart pounding. We're not alone in here, I whispered. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the pull of the cave itself, or maybe it was the fear that had started to gnaw at the back of my mind. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going deeper. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, suffocating me with a presence I couldn't explain. My breath quickened, my heart racing as I moved deeper into the labyrinth. The others were hesitant, their faces pale, but I urged them on. I couldn't let go. Not now. There was something in here, something I couldn't quite grasp, but I could feel it, alive, waiting for me to find it. We reached a narrow passage, the air thick and stale, but there was no turning back. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, like the cave was holding its breath, waiting to hear the sound of our footsteps. Then I saw it. The wall in front of me was covered in strange symbols, ones I hadn't noticed before. They weren't just scratched or painted. They seemed to be part of the rock itself, as though the stone had been shaped by some ancient hand. My fingers traced the markings, my mind racing, trying to make sense of them. The figures were twisted, contorted, and yet they felt familiar. Too familiar. Like I had seen them before, in dreams or forgotten memories. "James, we need to go back." Tom's voice broke through my trance. He sounded panicked, his voice high and strained. "This isn't right. This place, it's not just a cave." I glanced over at him. He looked terrified, his eyes wide, darting around the darkened space like a trapped animal. But I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close. "We're almost there," I muttered, more to myself than to him. My fingers trembled as they continued to trace the symbols, the sensation of something watching me creeping up my spine. "We have to keep moving." I could feel it then, the presence. Not in the air, not in the shadows, but in the very stone itself. It wasn't just a cave. It was something else. Something old. The walls were alive, breathing, shifting with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The cave wasn't just a place. It was a thing that had been waiting for us. Waiting for me. The further we went, the darker it became. The faint light from our headlamps barely touched the stone, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to stretch out in all directions. We rounded a corner, and that's when I saw him. Fago. He stood at the end of the passage, his figure blending with the shadows. His eyes glinted in the darkness, too sharp, too knowing. He hadn't been here before, had he? No, he couldn't have been. I would have noticed him. I would have. "You've gone too far." Fago's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it rang in my ears like a warning bell. "You need to turn back now." "Fago, what are you talking about?" I took a step toward him, my legs shaking, my mind racing. "There's something down here. Something alive. You have to know what it is." His eyes never left me, and the faintest flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "Some things are not meant to be found. The deeper you go, the harder it will be to leave. Don't make the same mistake I did." I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his voice, something that made me want to listen, but I pushed it aside. "I'm not leaving until I know what's down there. I need to understand it." He shook his head slowly, his expression turning grim. "You can't understand it, James. You can't even begin to grasp what it is. The cave, it's not what you think. It's been here longer than you can imagine. And it will take you, just like it took the others." The words hit me like a cold slap to the face. The others. The crew. The ones who had disappeared. I suddenly realized that we had been moving deeper for far too long. Too far, too fast. My hands gripped the wall beside me, the symbols now looking more like scratches. Scratches in the skin of something that didn't want to be touched. My stomach twisted. The air was thick with something I couldn't place, a kind of pressure that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the cave itself. "We're not going back," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. My feet moved before my brain could stop them. I couldn't turn back now. Not after everything we'd seen. Not after feeling this. I had to know. I had to see it for myself. "You're already too far gone." Fago's voice echoed in the darkness, fading as I moved deeper. His warning lost in the growing madness of the cave's pull. I kept going, despite the creeping dread tightening my chest. The walls seemed to close in around me, bending and warping as though they were alive. I could feel the cave breathing, its heartbeat syncing with mine, faster, faster. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers began again. Only this time, they weren't just whispers. They were voices. Soft at first, then louder. And they didn't sound like mine. They didn't sound like anyone's. "James," a voice whispered. My name, soft, almost loving. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it came again, louder. "James." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the cave, just the walls. But the whisper came again, clear as day. "You'll never leave." I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to process what I was hearing. It wasn't possible. I was imagining things. But the whispers, the voices, they weren't in my head. They were real. They were here. The shadows shifted, the walls trembled, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming weight of something pressing against me. It was the cave, yes, but it was more than that. It was something older, something hungry. I could feel its hunger, its desire to swallow me whole. I turned, running now, my feet pounding against the stone floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, I couldn't escape the feeling that the cave was catching up with me. It was all around me now, suffocating, closing in. And that voice, it was still there calling my name. James, James, you'll never leave. And I realized, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that I never would. I had seen enough to know this wasn't a normal cave. But nothing prepared me for what lay ahead. As I ventured deeper into the dark, my flashlight's beam flickered over the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of my own heart. The further we went, the more it felt like the earth itself was alive, like it was watching me, studying me, waiting for something. Or perhaps I was the one waiting for answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The air was thick and damp, the scent of decay hanging heavily in my lungs. It wasn't just the smell of dirt and stone. It was the scent of something older, something that hadn't seen light in centuries, maybe longer. I wasn't sure what I expected to find in this hidden chamber, but what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. My breath caught in my throat. The walls were lined with bone, human bone, layer upon layer like some twisted mosaic. There were skulls, ribs, femurs, all stacked so meticulously, so unervingly perfect, that they looked less like remnants of the past and more like part of the cave itself. As if the bones had been grown there, not deposited by any human hand. I could barely comprehend it. The bones were old, too old. There were carvings, too, strange symbols etched into the walls that seemed to pulse as if alive. I ran my fingers over them, cold to the touch. They didn't seem to be just markings. No, they felt wrong. Almost like they had been carved with intent, with purpose, with something far more terrifying than human hands. Then I saw it, the thing that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the chamber, there was a pit, deep and black, the kind of darkness that swallowed light whole. I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't even guess how deep it went. But what caught my attention wasn't the pit itself. It was what was around it, what was emerging from it. A shape. No shapes. They didn't have form, at least not in the way I understood form. They were fluid, shifting, like the darkness had taken shape and decided to crawl its way out of the pit. Tendrils of shadow stretched toward the walls, reaching out like fingers, but not fingers. No, these were something else. And then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze, no draft. The whispers weren't just voices. They were thoughts, sickening, alien thoughts that wormed their way into my mind, making me question if I was still in control of myself. Leave, one voice said. It is too late for you. Stay, another voice whispered, colder than the last. You belong here. I staggered back, trying to regain control of my thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it wasn't the whispers that terrified me the most. It was the movement. The way the shadows weren't shadows anymore. There was something else. Something more tangible. A mass. A thing. Something alive. A deep, guttural sound echoed from the pit, like something massive shifting, groaning, stretching into being. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing that was slowly rising from the darkness. It was so vast, so alien that I couldn't even begin to grasp what it was. The shape was ever-changing, rippling like water in a storm, but it was wrong. It was wrong in ways that went beyond physical form. It was wrong because it should not exist. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they had been rooted to the stone. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps as the thing reached toward me. No, not me. Toward us. It didn't matter who we were. It didn't matter that I was James Carter, a man who had explored caves all over the world. This thing, whatever it was, had seen everything before. It didn't care about me. It didn't care about the others with me. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them, the missing explorers. They weren't gone. They were trapped, their bodies somehow caught between the walls, their faces contorted in silent screams. Their hands reached out as if begging for release, but their mouths didn't move. The only sound was the soft hum of the entity in front of me, its shape pulsing like a heartbeat. They were part of it now, part of the cave, part of whatever ancient thing was hidden beneath this earth. I finally managed to turn, forcing my legs to obey. I had to escape, but the exit seemed to get farther and farther away. The cave was alive, alive with the whispers, alive with the shadows, alive with the promise of things I could never outrun. But even as I stumbled toward the tunnel, I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't just the cave I was running from. It was the thing that was already inside me, the thing I had unknowingly awakened. And it wasn't finished yet. The ground trembled beneath my feet, as if the entire cave was alive, breathing. The walls groaned, shifting, as though they were not stone but flesh, swollen with secrets that had been buried for centuries. Every footstep echoed in the hollow darkness, and the silence between those echoes was unnerving, thick, suffocating, like the very air was turning against me. I could feel it, the presence. Something behind me, just out of sight, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the breath caught in my throat. I spun around, expecting to see one of my team members, maybe Ben or Sarah, but there was nothing. Just shadows, stretching unnaturally along the cave floor. I shook my head, trying to shake the creeping fear that gnawed at the edge of my mind. The deeper we went, the more twisted this place became, the more it seemed to reach out for us. I had to get out. I turned back to face the path ahead, but there was no clear path anymore. The cave had changed. What had once been a straight corridor was now a maze of jagged rock and jagged edges, twisting and winding in on itself. The passage that had been ahead of me a moment ago was now completely blocked, as if the stone itself had closed in. My heart raced. I wasn't just running from a cave anymore. I was running from something inside it, something that wanted me to stay. I quickened my pace, each step echoing louder in my ears, the sound of my own heartbeat growing louder too. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs began to burn with the effort. I could still hear it, the soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound that was always just behind me, growing closer with every turn I made. I could feel the weight of its presence, a pressure that pressed down on my chest, suffocating me. It wasn't the cave itself. It was something else. Someone else. I could almost hear them. Footsteps scraping against the rock, like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I could sense them. Following. Watching. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. It sounded strange in the vastness of the cave, the echo bouncing off the walls, as if mocking me. No answer. But then, from deep within the shadows ahead, I heard a voice, low, raspy, but clear. It was almost familiar, as though it belonged to someone I'd known once, long ago. "James!" I froze. The voice wasn't Ben's. It wasn't Sarah's. It was something older, something that seemed to crawl into my mind like a shadow. Fago, the man, or whatever he was, who'd warned me to leave. But his voice now felt like a command. "Leave. You've gone too far." My body jerked forward, a reflex, and I sprinted ahead, my feet slipping on the damp stone, my heart hammering like it wanted to burst from my chest. But every time I thought I could outrun it, the darkness stretched farther, swallowing the light from my headlamp, bending around me like a living thing. I kept running, mind racing with thoughts that didn't make sense, but they wouldn't stop. The walls were closing in. The walls were alive. The walls were listening. I had to escape. Suddenly, I heard again, the voice. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, and it was right behind me. "James!" I spun around in panic, gasping for air, and saw nothing but the endless darkness. But then the air shifted. It grew cold, freezing cold. It felt like ice in my veins, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I could have sworn I saw movement. Something tall, gaunt, standing just out of reach of my flashlight. I could see its eyes, or at least I thought I could. A flash of light, just for a second, and then it was gone. But the footsteps, those scraping, shuffling footsteps, they didn't stop. They were getting closer. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out for something to hold on to, but the rock was slick and unforgiving. My foot slipped, and I fell hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I hit the ground with a sickening thud, but I didn't have time to think about the pain. I had to keep moving. I scrambled to my feet, shaking, desperate, and that's when I heard it again, closer this time, right behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, but the darkness refused to reveal anything. But then came the laughter. It was a low chuckle, barely audible, but it rattled me to my core. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. I started to run again, but this time it wasn't the walls I was fighting against. It was the feeling in my gut. The thing that told me I wasn't alone, that something far worse was following me. A shadow crossed in front of me, dark and shifting, and then I heard it again, clearer now, the voice of Thago, but this time it wasn't warning. It was laughing. Too late, James. It's already too late. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and I was no longer sure if I was running out of the cave, or into something far worse. And then, in the pitch-black silence, I heard the voice again, this time louder, clearer. You never left. I don't remember how I made it out of the cave. It's like the entire journey collapsed into a blur of dark shadows and frantic footsteps. My lungs burned from the stale air. My eyes strained from the sudden brightness when I stumbled out into the daylight. The trees around me were still and silent. The silence was so heavy it pressed against my ears. For a moment, I stood there, just breathing, catching my breath as if I had escaped something. Maybe I had, or maybe I hadn't. My legs were shaky, my whole body trembling, but I couldn't stop moving. I needed to get out, get away from the mountain. The town was just a few miles away. I had to get back, to find some semblance of normalcy. I heard my breath in ragged gasps as I took slow steps away from the cave's entrance. The sun was higher than I remembered it being, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was something else. I wiped my brow with the back of my hand, feeling the dampness. The air was thin, cool, almost comforting in comparison to the suffocating atmosphere of the cave. But then I stopped. Something in the corner of my eye, just a flash of movement, made me freeze. I looked over my shoulder. No one. Just trees, rustling in the wind. It was then I realized something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. My heart pounded, and my fingers felt numb as I reached for my gear bag that I hadn't even noticed had come with me. I hadn't stopped to check if it was all there, if I had left anything behind. I was just running on pure instinct. But something in the air felt different now. The world outside the cave, the real world, it felt foreign. Like I didn't belong here, or like I had never truly left. My body was out of the cave, but my mind, my soul, it was still trapped somewhere in that darkness. Somewhere beneath the earth, where Thago's warning echoed through my thoughts. You never left, he had said. Those words, my final conversation with him, felt like they were crawling through my veins. I staggered back toward the entrance, breathing heavy, my eyes darting around the clearing. I wasn't sure if I was still trying to escape, or if I was searching for something I couldn't name. I wanted to feel relief, but the nagging feeling that I was being watched kept clawing at my chest. I glanced down at my hands. The tremor in my fingers was still there. I looked at my reflection in the glistening surface of a nearby puddle. My heart froze. I stood there, staring at the water. It rippled slightly from the breeze, but it wasn't just the ripple that caught my attention. It was me. Or rather, it wasn't me. My reflection didn't move the way I did. It was a second behind. My hand raised, but the reflection stayed still, then mimicked the movement too late. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, and tried to shake it off. No, it was just the stress, the fear. It had to be. I took another step, my legs like lead. But when I looked back into the puddle, my reflection was still a split second off. Still slow, still wrong. I staggered back, stumbling as the cold sweat crawled down my back. No, I whispered, my voice sounding foreign to my ears. No, no, no. I turned and bolted, no longer caring about the woods, the path, the town I'd left behind. I just needed to get away. Away from myself. I didn't want to face the truth, but I knew it was already too late. I had come too far. But it wasn't the reflection that haunted me anymore. It was the feeling that I had never really left the cave at all. It was inside me. The shadows were inside me, and I couldn't escape that, no matter how far I ran. The cave had marked me, and I could still feel its pulse, its breath. I couldn't run from it. I wasn't free. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't explain. The trees, the wind, the light itself, everything felt wrong. The deeper I looked into the world around me, the more it seemed to twist and bend in ways I couldn't quite grasp. The lines between what was real and what wasn't were blurring, and I knew that the escape I thought I had found was just another part of the cave's trap. I was never meant to leave. In the distance, I thought I saw something move, just beyond the edge of my vision, something tall and shadowed, standing still in the trees. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, as though it was swallowing me whole with each step. I wasn't sure if I was still running, or if I had already given in. You never left. I heard it again, a whisper in my ear. It was my own voice, but it didn't sound like me. The cave had found me, and now it wouldn't let me go.